Firstly, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Aapti and welcome you to the first roundtable for data deliberations that we're hosting. Thank you all for being here and joining us today. Aapti is a public research institute. We're based in Bangalore, India, and our work explores the intersection of tech and society. So our research focuses on three main verticals: governance and citizens, the future of workers, and the data economy. And we've launched the Data Economy Lab with support from Umidiyar Networks India. And we hope for this to be a collaborative space where we can design solutions around rebalancing the data economy. And we're looking very closely at the concept of data stewardship and sort of in that space recognize that data stewardship can unlock the value of data, societal value of data, while ensuring that we're protecting the rights of individuals and communities. And we define a data steward as an intermediary that would lie between users and that could sort of simplify the process of sharing data while also enabling greater control to users to make decisions around the data. So as we sort of dive deeper into this concept of data stewardship, we wanted to understand how we can most effectively move from theory to practice and explore use cases of data stewardship. So we're looking at, in specific, issues like women's safety, migration, community data, non-personal data as well, and wanted to organize these deliberations as a way to engage with experts like we have today and dive a little bit deeper into these conversations. And sort of my previous research, I've looked at mobility data and how this has been shared in cities across the world. And I've seen that sort of when this is being done responsibly, it can lead to data-driven policies that promote sustainability, equitable services, and more efficient services as well. But on today's topic, we're really curious to understand the role of data in creating gender responsive and inclusive cities. And we see this being an increasingly relevant topic. Even with COVID, we see a large percentage of healthcare workers are in fact women. So facilitating their access and ensuring they're able to navigate cities with ease is really important and critical to think about. And also I think we see and acknowledge both personally and otherwise that there are visible ramifications of this lack of data that exists on women. And so the gender data gap has ramifications on our ability to access cities, but also the fact that several issues like gender-based or sex-based violence are not addressed significantly. And this inhibits our ability to move around the city, but also access economic opportunities. So in response to this, we've also seen international organizations start to call for the collection of gender disaggregated or gender specific data. And so this has prompted us at Aapti to consider issues of governance and accountability, specifically as we're interested to explore how this data is being collected and stored and shared. And it's not just being collected by civil society organizations, but also by sort of sensitive data is being collected by safety apps. We're seeing the rise of wearable IoT devices, mobility service providers, social media platforms are all collecting data. And on that, we see that the collection or extraction of this data can result in or may result in individual and collective level harms. This could result in, for example, increased surveillance of particular communities or individuals and increased policing of those areas. We're seeing it may lend itself to the creation of architectures of fear where certain neighborhoods are perhaps abandoned or considered sort of far more vulnerable, or that there are data breaches at an individual level where personal data is shared with third parties without consent. So these concerns have made us think of a couple questions, and we're diving deeper into these over the course of this discussion as well. Who should be in control of the data collected on women's safety, and how should it be shared and with who? And how do we redistribute power in this context? How can we lend power to citizens and community groups that interact and understand the needs of women best? And on this, we've understood that these efforts around data collection that have shown promise have often been led by civil society, and some of whom we have today as speakers, and we're lucky to have today. So we really want to learn from these practices and these existing models of data sharing, but also envision how we can create systems of governance for this data that is underpinned by concepts of transparency and accountability. And as I mentioned, data stewardship, we're considering this application also around women's safety. So on this, we see or imagine the role of of a data stewardship playing a couple different roles. We see potentially a data steward enhancing the trust between stakeholders, which seems to be something that perhaps limits or inhibits sharing at this point. Also enabling better control over data, something that is linked or provides more agency to women over who the data is shared with and how, but also facilitating the active participation of women. There's not just a lack of data on women, but women do not have decision-making power, whether it is concerned with urban planning or in transport departments or agencies. And then lastly, we see a steward potentially creating a set of technical or governance mechanisms that can safeguard private data, sensitive data, or even non-personal data. So these are some of the sort of roles of data stewards that we see today, but we hope to sort of further discuss it over the course of this conversation and see what that would look like in practice as well. So we're very excited you could all join us today, and special thanks to all of our speakers who are spending the time to share their expertise and experience. I'll quickly introduce each one of them. We're joined by Dr. Kalpana Viswanath, who is the CEO and co-founder of SafetiPin, a social enterprise that uses data and tech to build safer, more inclusive and smart cities. SafetiPin has worked with more than 30 cities in India and in other developing countries, and collects public space data and carries out what they refer to as safety audits, which uses multiple sources through the My SafetiPin app. SafetiPin routinely works with governments to use this data for better planning and maintenance of cities. We are also joined by Jillian Kowalchuk from London, who is the founder and CEO of Safe and the City. Safe in the City is a personal safety navigation app which helps you route, share, and rate your walks in London. And Safe in the City has also recently partnered with UN Women UK to carry out a pilot and demonstrate technology and data-driven insights into women's lived experiences of violence and harassment in public spaces. Jillian was given the Exceptional Talent in Technology by the UK Home Office and was listed as the top 20 women in data in the UK. Last but not least, we're joined by Amit Bhatt, who is the Executive Director for Integrated Transport at WRI India. Amit is based in Delhi and provides vision and leadership to all transport initiatives across WRI India, Sustainable Cities. He's also led the research carried out by WRI's Embark Sustainable Urban Mobility team, where they led a pilot to collect data on commuters in Bhopal and identify gender differences in travel patterns and also outline women's perception of local public transport. And this data was then used to provide a set of actionable recommendations to various stakeholders within the city. So again, thank you all for joining us. And before we jump into the session, a couple of very quick housekeeping rules. As this is a webinar setting, we do still want to encourage audience participation, so please introduce yourself if you feel like doing so in the chat. We are recording this session and will hopefully be also posting the video on YouTube tomorrow. We also are live tweeting this session, so if you'd like to follow along on Twitter, please follow us at Aapti Institute. We are using the hashtag Aapti Data Deliberations. And then finally, if you have any questions, please direct them towards the Q&A box, and we can leave the chat open for discussion, free-flowing discussion. And then finally, at the end of this discussion, we will be holding a short sort of poll, so please just spend the time, maybe a minute or so, to give us feedback on this session. All right, so without further ado, I want to jump in to our first question and direct this to all three panelists. How do we sort of define safety in the context of cities, and how has data been used how has data been collected successfully to better understand safety? And if we could start with Kalpana, that would be great.
Thank you, Suha. I'm happy to be here at this panel along with Jillian and Amit. Your introduction was interesting, I think, in looking at the different aspects of data in terms of whether it's privacy, whether it's the architecture, whether it's about who collects it, who has access to it, and who uses it. I think these are all the interesting sort of elements of data that we need to look at. But to start with, what is women's safety? I think women's safety is it's a very sort of widely used term, which means different things to different people. And often to governments, it means very different things than what it means to us in civil society and those who are working to really enhance women's rights to the city. So I would say women's safety encompasses to me uh, enhancing women's right to the city. So it is based within a framework of rights. It is not a framework of protection. So it's not as if we need, you know, just a set of apps or just more policing or just more CCTV cameras and ways that women get protected, but rather how do we expand women's access to opportunities? Because what happens with the lack of safety, the impact is the fear. It's not even the actual violence, it's the fear that women face on an everyday basis when they step out in a city, especially after dark. And that fear begins to determine how I think I have the right to the city. So it may determine, like I will say, oh, I won't take this job because I have to come back late at night. Or that route is not safe, there's not good public transport. Families, we've seen in Delhi, in India, in low income areas, they will not send their daughters to higher school or even university because of lack of safety. So the lack of safety is not just the issue of actual violence that women face. The lack of safety is the fear which prevents women from being equal citizens in our cities. And that equality of citizenship, that equality of rights, that equality of opportunities, to me, is what we are trying to address and balance when we address women's safety as a concern. And I think so. I would like a really broad perspective, and in that context, it includes stakeholders to safety that are a very wide range of people, not just the police and women, but institutions, urban planners, uh, organizations that work on public transport, mobility, government agencies, municipalities, municipal actors. So a whole range of people become stakeholders in the conversation. So it doesn't become a conversation between women and policing. It is a much wider conversation about mobility and access. And in that, the data that your second question is, there is so much data, right? We have Google data, which can now track cell phone data, which tells us where we are, right? There's big, large data sets out there, which many of us don't have access to, but governments have access to, corporations have access to. So there's that whole area of data, which is really very fuzzy, which we don't know who has, how much data about us is out there. Then there is the data which governments put out. In some countries, it's very open. A lot of data is available in public. In countries like India, we find it's very difficult to get data, except for census and some national survey. But for example, even crime data, we are not able to get very accurate local level crime data. It's very aggregated data that we get, and when we get aggregated data, it's not usable for us to make a difference. Then there is data that is collected by different organizations, like all the three panelists on this. And what SafetiPin does, for example, is collect both user-generated data as well as data through other methods, which we sort of collect data, whether it's through image analysis or other sort of surveys, place-based surveys that we do. And we aggregate all these different data sets where we try and get both women's voices, but also a sort of a sense of what is the public space. Recognizing, my last point is that everyone doesn't have a smartphone in many countries, even in countries like India. So we do then have to go beyond an app in order to make sure the voices of the most vulnerable are heard. So I think in developing countries, in countries in the global south, technology has to be used with other tools to ensure that it is truly capturing the voices of those who are vulnerable, left out, disempowered in our cities, and does not become one more method of privilege, which we know is something that plagues all our cities. And I think that's broadly my answer to these two questions. And thank you.
Thanks, Kalpana. Amit, I would love, to get your opinion on this too. I know that in our discussion, that was a challenge you highlighted, that India doesn't really have accessible data to draw from, or credible sources to draw from. So that often means supplementing these data collection efforts. Can you tell us a little bit about what your experience has been in defining also what constitutes women's safety in transport, and how you were able to access these data or collect this data?
Absolutely, Suha. So one is that if you look at an aggregate number, even on the transportation side, you will realize that not everything is right when it comes to safety and safety of women. And while data is a challenge, but if you look at the broad indicators, you will get what I'm saying. So typically, if you look at per capita trip rates in Indian cities, so which is what's an average number of trips which a person performs in a city? Well, some will be performing more trips, some will not be performing trips at all. But if we average it out, that number in Indian cities is somewhere around 1 to 1.21. Now, that number in some of the developed countries is almost double, in fact, more than double. So why is this stark difference? And one of the reasons why this number is so less in our cities is that we have a very low workforce participation when it comes to work. So typically around 27% women who are in the age of 15 years or above at a national level are employed. And while you can expect that this number would be higher in, let's say, a city like Delhi, because there's a huge amount of opportunity which exists, but that number is less than half. Now, the question is, why is this less than half? And there are multiple reasons to it, but safety and security has a very strong linkage to this number. So when we started to look at this issue in slightly more detail, and we got a small grant from DFID, and with help of a lot of other partners, including Kalpana and SafetiPin, we went into a city of Bhopal to kind of investigate this matter through a data-driven approach. And what we found was there was hardly any data. So typically, public transport agencies, one, don't collect a lot of data, right? So even elementary data like origin, destination, trip lengths, that data is with transit agencies, but they don't systematically analyze even some of the elementary data which is required for planning for, let us say, bus operation, public transport operation. So that's one. Secondly, when it comes to data around violence against women or women's safety or even concerns, nothing at all. And one of the reasons we saw that why we don't have any data is that typically, so let's say if there's an incident which happens in a bus, one, you have to report to incident through a helpline or otherwise. There is no reporting at all. And even if someone tries to report, we found that there is so much pressure from the drivers, on the conductor, even passengers who are traveling, because everyone feels that, oh, we are getting late and this will only add to my timeline. And so there's so much pressure that women even don't report these incidents. So when we looked at the actual data around, let us say, women's safety in public transport in Bhopal, no data at all. So that was one. Secondly, I think one is the quantitative kind of aspect of data, but there is also a qualitative aspect when it comes to safety, which is a big issue is around perception. Now, if someone is not perceiving to be safe in a public transport, whether it's one woman versus 60 odd men in the bus, those kinds of things, that perception data is next to impossible. So the question then became, how do you collate this data and how do you kind of connect this data? And we did some primary exercise. One, with Kalpana's help, we collected the SafetiPin data, but also we did a lot of focused group discussions with women. And we were surprised to find that more than 80% respondents said that they had experienced harassment in public transport, and which was surprising. But what was even more surprising was that half of these respondents said they experience it on a regular basis, on a frequent basis. So that is something which was kind of unbelievable to many of the people who were involved. But for others who are working in this space, for them, this is a repetitive phenomena which happens across the city. It's just that we don't have mechanism to collect the data, to pull the data, and even disseminate these results. And that's why we see people kind of being surprised to hear this story, which is a regular phenomenon.
Thanks, Amit. And Jillian, I want to rephrase the question a little bit. On one hand, I think the data landscape may be slightly different in the UK in terms of what is accessible and not. But I wanted to ask, given that a lot of SafeTPin or Safe in the City's work is crowdsourced anecdotal data as well and very qualitative, how is this data used by individuals to perhaps seek or utilize this as a sort of demand to change and make spaces safer? I'd love to hear sort of what your opinion is on that and sort of what the challenges have been around collecting this data, whether there's similar issues that Amit talked about.
Great. Thank you firstly for having me, and yeah, great privilege to speak with some key experts in this space. So, I mean, I would love to kind of dive in. There was some really great points that both Kalpana and Amit had raised. In terms of the definition of safety, I think we still find that quite challenging, even in the UK, as it does have such broad strokes to that definition, and it really depends on the stakeholders that you're engaging of that. You know, traditionally, I think safety falls into the kind of physical risks, anything kind of covered by insurance, those types of things. So when you do approach with women's safety, it often gets blanketed into this kind of, we have these public infrastructures to safeguard people, but it's not actually looking at the other experiences as Amit and Kalpana raised. So I think one of the key things is being able to look at the citizen's definition of safety and what that means. And I think having a specific target group, and ours is also women, being able to help define what that safety means, because there are so many different correlational factors of, again, perception coming into or fear of crime, as well as, you know, common experiences like sexual harassment and other sexual misconducts. So I think that's part of the, you know, role and opportunity for data stewardship is really being open to designing those definitions around the groups that you want those voices to be collected and understood. In terms of the UK, there definitely is a different landscape in terms of data collection. We're very lucky that there is a lot of open source data available. They call it the data store, especially the Mayor of London is quite a big champion of that. So police information, while we work a little bit more hand in hand with the police to receive more specific information about crime, there is a lot of information available, which makes it a great opportunity for technology or other experts to come in to that. There's definitely the area of this gap that I think we talked about or was raised in terms of safety really being defined and represented to the majority of the people who are represented in power and leadership. So traditionally in the UK, that's kind of designed around a white middle-class man. And that lens is how we've designed so many solutions around building our cities, that it's really a difficult process to kind of undo that lens until we have more information that is gender and sex disaggregated. So what has been working for us is being able to work with different partners. So as a social enterprise, we are looking at that kind of impact metric, but we also want to remain at least outside of the space where we might have to just fundraise and have a particular niche in that kind of charity model. So being able to, through our app, generate a kind of demand and a lifestyle approach to how people travel. We don't actually classify ourselves as a safety app because I think that can be quite a challenge. There's so many safety apps nowadays, or wearables and different solutions out there, that it can be quite noisy and, again, kind of confusing for consumers to know which one is which. And what we started with Safe in the City is building safety as something that you can use while you're navigating. So navigation being something that we hope that everyone would use, although, again, kind of anecdotally, we have, jokes about women maybe not being as great of navigators, so predominantly users of our app. And one of the interesting things in doing that is that it kind of creates safety in that neutral playing field, and that safety can become something that as you move through it, you can actually share your information about how you feel about those areas. So one of the things that we do collect based on some criminology, I guess, inputs of how the data is collected here is we've created an end of journey kind of scoring system to look at some of those perceptual understandings. So then we can also look at how could routes be, how are routes being matched in terms of our user base, and how could they maybe later be personalized to not move everybody one way, but actually move them in the directions and the spaces that they feel comfortable, and also go backwards to see why is that something that they're not uncomfortable, say the lighting, for example. The other interesting thing is around how we've captured I guess, categorical or quantitative information, as well as the free text information or qualitative, so that we can look at that understanding of even how the definitions of safety or these types of incidents are experienced by people. So we have a very broad range, and I'm sure it's reflected in a lot of research and even in India of what sexual harassment even means. Like, what is sexual assault? Is it, someone trying to kiss me, or is it, a full-on kind of rape? And that being something that also we are trying to shape into our narratives so that we can have an educational component and help people understand the different experiences that they might have, and how to also kind of bridge that accuracy of information. So yeah, there's so much that I think we dove into, but I don't want to take up too much time. I'm sure we'll dive into some more of these areas.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jillian. I actually wanted to take a point that Amit brought up earlier around the sort of perhaps not really being keen to report, given the stigma attached to a lot of incidents around sexual harassment, or even any of these gender-based forms of violence that women experience. And around crowdsourcing data, I just wanted to understand how are women feeling about reporting anonymously? Is there a sense of comfort in doing this anonymously? Are there challenges with collecting crowdsourced data? And Kalpana, it'd be great to hear from you on that to start with. I think you're on mute, Kalpana.
There are several barriers to women's reporting, right? So one is the stigma. The second is actually the feeling that nothing is really going to happen. So unless there's a strong trust and faith in the policing system, which many women in many countries do not have, they are reluctant to report, the crime. And the third point is what Jillian talked about what is sexual harassment. There is, there's such a variation. So certainly if you've been raped, it is a crime. But if you go to the police station and say, this man followed me from the bus stop to my house, it's unlikely they'll take it that seriously, and unfortunately, because we do know that stalking is a very, very big problem that women face, especially young women. school-going and young college girls face stalking as a very big problem. So I think it's the question of, there's so many barriers to reporting. And so therefore, anywhere in the world, whether it's in the or in India or in South Africa, it is a highly underreported crime. The second reason it's underreported is, like Amit said, you're in a bus, somebody fills you up. Who are you going to report? How are you going to report this crime? You're walking on the street, someone whistles at you. There is no reporting possibility there, So I think what crowdsourcing can do is to get a sense of the extent and the magnitude of the problem. We do not know the magnitude of this problem. So the survey that Bhopal, similar, they have faced some kind of sexual harassment. Are you losing me?
Yes, we are.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. So have faced sexual harassment. Yeah. And so therefore the percentage of women, and this is, for example, in the UK, there is the Everyday Sexism Project, which also talks about how ubiquitous sexual harassment is. Yeah. So I think what crowdsourcing does, it gives you a sense of what is the extent of the problem, where is the problem, and then when you have the qualitative stories, is to begin to unpack what does it mean to women, how does it impact their lives, So I think this is a problem that goes beyond crime. Mm-hmm. It is something we need to look at as a society, that if half the population does not feel safe enough to walk out of their homes, it is a human rights issue. It is an issue of rights, which we have to look at within that framework. And I come back to that because while I appreciate that the crime framework, and we must look at the crimes, and we must look at punishment, and we must look at all that, we mustn't limit this issue to that, because we know that this will never be fully reported. But what do I as a woman want? I want that bus ride to be safe. Now, how do we make that bus ride safe? There are many, many things we can do. And I think that's where data and interventions need to come together. So if Jillian and SafetiPin and Safe in the City are getting the stories, and WRI is doing surveys, we have the stories. Now, if we want to answer that and make a difference, what are the interventions? What are the programs that can make a difference? And I think that's what the data needs to do. It has to speak to the people who can make a difference. And that is a whole range of stakeholders, as I said right at the beginning. And I think that's where all forms of data, and crowdsourced data is very important, surveys, official data, media stories, everything. I think we need to put all of it together to get a holistic picture, because each one is like one part of the elephant, right? So we're not getting a picture of what is the elephant. And there is an elephant in the room, which is the fact that women are not equal in our cities.
Right. I had a quick follow-up question for Kalpana, and the same to Amit as well, based on the research you've carried out. Do women have concerns around privacy, around the data they're sharing, whether it is through an app or whether it is in context of surveys, given the sensitivity of this information?
So I can quickly answer, and then Amit can do this thing. On the survey part, interestingly, we did not find women were not willing to report, which is why you're getting figures of 90% women saying that they have faced harassment. Mm-hmm. So interestingly, they are willing to say it's happened to me. That's why I think it's not the stigma alone which is preventing greater reporting.
Right.
In terms of the privacy of the app, I think in India, at least still, the number of people using apps is not very large. And I think, to be honest, these concerns of privacy, they are not yet in the forefront. There are many. I think we have several steps to reach there, actually, to get millions of women to actually share their stories. But yes, I think there is the fear. The one fear on privacy is these tracking apps. A lot of apps, which is what Jillian said, she doesn't want to be called a safety app, I agree, even SafetiPin is not a safety app. A lot of them are either about emergency, press a button when you're in danger, or tracking, where the tracking often becomes actually stalking. So boyfriends can stalk, see where their girlfriends are going, husbands can do it, parents can follow their children, which becomes again another way of controlling women's movements. So I think that's where the issue of privacy is there. There are actually many tracking apps which say that the person who use phone you put it into, they don't even see that it's there. So women don't even know that their partner is tracking them, or parents are tracking them. And honestly, I would say even parents tracking children without telling them is a human rights violation. I don't think it's correct even for parents to do that without telling their children. So there are safety concerns, I think, on this a lot. And the third safety concern I would say is the amount of CCTV coverage data that's being taken, that is done in all our cities today. Where is this going? Who is looking at it? And what kind of privacy settings, what kind of safety settings are there? There was a case in India in the metro where young couples were sitting in the metro station and making out a little bit, and the metro officials were watching this. So it was actually became a kind of a voyeurism, and actually you need CCTVs because you want safety, but who is watching it? And does it then come into the arena of moral policing, telling people, young women, telling others what they can do in public and not? So it's really complicated. And I think, we do need a lot of data stewardship to begin to unpack some of these very disturbing and complex concerns.
Thanks for that, Kalpana. In fact, that was part of the question I wanted to ask Amit too. Once we have this data collected, whether it is CCTV footage or otherwise, firstly, sort of what the privacy concerns are with collecting that, but also how do we activate the use of this data responsibly?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's where the big problem is. So even agencies which are collecting the data, the question is, what are you doing with that data, right? So that's one. And so for example, I'll give you, so many bus agencies in India have something called an electronic ticketing machine, where someone boards the bus, he or she gives you the origin destination, and then you issue a ticket. Now that machine is a fantastic device of finding the actual origin, destination, time of the journey, type of the passenger. You can do a whole host of analysis with that ETM machine alone. But in most cases, the data is only used as this machine is used as a calculator to calculate how many tickets were sold, right? So that's the point, that even you don't collect data, and even when these agencies are collecting data, they are not using it for any planning purpose. So for example, in Bhopal, in one of our focus groups, we actually asked the drivers and conductors of the buses to share their opinion and perception around safety. And I don't know, you'll be surprised or not, but 100%, and that's 100% of drivers and conductors said safety is not an issue in Bhopal buses. So all the 100% respondents, not an issue. And almost 30% of the drivers and conductors said women are equally responsible for their safety. And it has to go with the type of dresses, the time of journey, and all. So the whole host of kind of excuses which were made in terms of why the system, so why is this happening, and then women are equally responsible. So basically what we actually found from this, that one, violence against women in public transport, we saw has a huge linkage to restriction of women's freedom of movement and mobility, which in turn impacts the women's access, economic and social activities, and then which then impacts the economic and social development of the society at large. So I think this is a much larger problem, but unfortunately we have still not grasped even the basics of the problem when it comes to women's safety and transport, which is what we were looking at in some of these.
Right. Thanks for that. And I want to shift gears here really quickly to look at, and Jillian, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, looking at the impact of collecting data on communities. What do you think sort of perhaps the benefits have been, but also what have the drawbacks been of this data collected in your view?
Yeah, sure. There's some really great conversations happening here. I'd love to, I feel like this could be a conversation, a series that we could dive into quite a lot. So in terms of the, I think, benefits, and one thing that we're very conscious of Safe in the City is not to, scapegoat areas and kind of place them at the heart of the fault. But there are patterns and trends that we can definitely pay attention to help kind of source what types of interventions or what types of stakeholders might need to play a part in looking at how we can design and maybe measure a difference in that particular space. So I think in general, I think being able to paint the picture, which is that actually these are happening in all types of spaces to all types of women. Of course, there are plenty to say that there's a lot more marginalized women or the intersection of different kind of risk groups that aren't as maybe welcome in society face often a lot more harassment and different violent behaviors. So being able to have people, move through different parts of the city, and we don't reroute people at this point. So it's simply understanding those perceptions, those types of experiences, being able to look at those trends versus kind of an individual experience, and taking that for kind of being able to kind of correlate that to the masses is something really important, and what the tool is supposed to be kind of designed for. Being able to also offer safety as a means, as kind of Kalpana said, we also think this is a human rights. You have the right to safety in any type of space, and being able to recognize that a lot of our technologies that we use, especially in kind of Europe, is they often lack any safety functionality. The responsibility is all on the person. When you sign up to use the app, they might sign your life away in this terms and conditions saying that they kind of absolve any responsibility, whereas in actuality that doesn't actually cover it. And there are these costs and consequences that I think to underpin really the importance of this. I think we recognize societally this is an issue, but being able to draw those economic costs will start to bring in businesses and government to pay a lot more attention. So I think that's one of the missing pieces of the puzzle. And by building our platform around mobility, there's definitely a correlation of time spent in specific areas. So if you're drawn into the kind of center where you're going to spend all your money, meet your friends, maybe not now since COVID, but traditionally these are places that you would spend a lot more time and money in. And being able to show that people might be moving out of areas because of these types of experiences can help us underpin kind of what are these costs to potential businesses or areas. I think we've been very cautious with the drawbacks. Of course, we recognize that bias comes in as kind of predominantly a smartphone application. We do have a web format for reporting, but definitely need to pay attention that when we are drawing generalizations, that we are also being representative of more marginalized communities that might not be reporting as frequently. And I think being able to offer that two-way benefit of being able to say, this is why we're building safety functionalities, whether it's emergency and non-emergency, to also have reporting, something that we can kind of start to expect throughout different technologies, is a part of how we can build that trust. We can actually standardize a lot more information. We can link those gaps. And I think that's quite important for us.
Kalpana, I had a similar question for you. How do you minimize the community level harm? Like Jillian said, often it sort of gives a negative spatial association to a community by marking it unsafe. So how do we collect data sort of minimizing this harm or acknowledging that the harm that this could cause?
This is actually very interesting.
Sorry, Kalpana, I don't hear you very well.
Collecting data with SafetiPin. Hear me better?
Kalpana, I seem to be.
Can you hear me better without the video?
Yeah, perhaps without the video would be better.
Sorry, my bandwidth could be a little bad.
Much better.
So
now.
I'm going to try and do it without the video. Yeah. Sorry, you can't see my face. This is an interesting question. When we began collecting data using our safety audits, a lot of people said that, oh, it's the poor areas that are going to be stigmatized as being less safe because of poorer infrastructure. But we didn't find that so, and I'll tell you why. Because in our safety audit, we measured two sets of parameters. One is the physical infrastructure, which would be the lighting or how good the sidewalk is and how open the area is. But we also measure the social environment and the social usage of the space. So we look at how many people are out in public spaces. What kind of activity takes place on the street? Is there natural surveillance? Is it a street with just, high walls and nobody on the streets? And we found that actually maybe while low-income neighborhoods may score less on certain physical infrastructure parameters, they didn't necessarily score less on social environment. And therefore, we do not find uniformly that it is the more higher income areas which are safer. So I think that was the first learning that we had. But to the second point of answering, how do we make sure they're not stigmatized? And that's where SafetiPin, our work has always been that the data we collect, we work with the city government and the municipal government. We give them that data in order for them to use it to improve the public space. So our aim was never to say, let us just say, oh, this is red, green, and orange, and have a heat map. We do have that on our app, yes. But behind that, we take that data and we try and we tell the government, how do you make red into orange and orange into green? What exact interventions can you do to improve safety? So I think, that's what we do as SafetiPin. And I think that's what we need to do. It's like, if it's an app which is just collecting data to put it out there, that's a different kind of an app. But a social enterprise where we want to make a change, where we want to actually improve safety, we do share the data. And therefore, we are trying our best not to stigmatize places, but to help. Also, we often work with that data with the local community. So we get them to actually use the data to do advocacy with their local officials and authorities. So it becomes more of an empowering tool, the data, rather than something which is coming from above and telling and making decisions independent of what people want. So I think it's really, we have to do the hard work. There is no easy way to do this work. You have to hear the community voices. You have to reach the most vulnerable and the most who have the least privilege, work with these different communities and try and do advocacy, change the way that governments work, municipalities work. And over time, you begin to have the impact that you want to have. So I think it's a long process, it's hard work. And I think an app or a single technology is no silver bullet. It can only be part of the process where we bring about change on the ground.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kalpana. Jillian, I had a question based off of also Kalpana's response. It's my understanding that Safe in the City also shares data with the Metropolitan Police Department, and there's a kind of reciprocal engagement there. Given that there is a third party in a sense in the loop, how do you maintain accountability of what data is shared and sort of the privacy ramifications that it entails?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, again, drawing back to that kind of definition of safety, there's definitely a lot within women's safety that would be classified as crimes. And so the police are kind of that stakeholder that does need to be engaged, especially because these are, again, massively underreported. And how it works with the police here is that essentially, again, being able to start to close the gap of that tip of the iceberg phenomenon that they're getting less information related to these types of sexual harassment and other women's safety concerns. In the UK, I think they ran, our transportation system, Transport for London, ran a campaign where 90% of women had experienced sexual harassment but chose not to report it. And again, playing into they didn't think it would make a difference. So, what is the point when the structure is kind of set up against you in some ways? So the police definitely have a recognition of that area, that we need to find other ways to source information of these types of complaints or actual crimes to be able to better interrogate them. We work on a more aggregate and population level, so it's again adding more in terms of the intelligence versus an individual report. We do have our kind of emergency number that you can call within the app. So we do encourage people, if it is an emergency or if it is a crime, then they can have that ability to do so. But, I guess we haven't luckily come to this, but, if there was a very serious incident that happened in public, that might be information that we would have to kind of further investigate with them. But the information provided back is a dissemination tool essentially for, again, information that is relevant to, a public crisis. We alerted, for example, there was a London Bridge terrorist attack. So people, again, just unknowingly moving into these spaces through Google Maps or these other technologies, we want to equip them to have the same public benefit to provide people with that information. And related to kind of those specific areas, we do know, the higher risk areas of certain types of crimes related to kind of pedestrians and people on usually personal safety, theft, and so forth. So we can also engage people in the ability to reduce the chances of crime by being able to kind of take different steps and precautions to their own personal safety as well as their community as they're going through it. So we really see it as a two-way benefit, and we do, again, work with different organizations like the Mayor of London and UN Women, so that this information, we're building that trust and accountability from within, so we can show people this, this one report kind of fits into this bigger piece that can be amplified and actually change a lot more of the concerns that we're having, and again, specify in a different space, what interventions would make most sense for that type of pattern we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And similarly on accountability, Amit, I wanted to throw this in your direction as well. Part of our initial discussion before this series was one of the challenges is we don't have a data infrastructure necessarily that collates or pools data, and we don't necessarily have the right capacity. So what do we need to do to first create that capacity and institute some of these accountability mechanisms at a state level, perhaps, as they collect data?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other issue is, so for example, if you look at bus agencies in India, barring the managing director, who is either an IAS officer or a state level administrative officer and keeps off rotating, anyone at a senior or mid level in any of these bus agencies which is involved with planning, operation, management of services. There was not a single woman involved in any of these functions. So the result is that there is no mechanism institutionally to even discuss some of the elementary issues which concerns women's safety. So that's one. The second is, I mean, if you look at, and when we looked at this whole kind of women's safety in public transport in Bhopal, we found while there are certain issues which are common across the city when it comes to violence against women, but we also found that there are some distinct issues linked to a distinct chain of the journey. So for example, walking from a house to bus stop is one which has some peculiar aspect. Waiting at the bus stop has some peculiar aspect. Even boarding at the bus. So for example, what we found was in case of informal transit or minibuses, when the bus would stop at the bus stop to pick passenger, the conductor would stand at the bus door. Now the door is only a meter wide. And then when the conductor stands, it makes the situation worse for women to either enter or leave the bus, right? So issues like that, and then the traveling in bus. The question then becomes, how do you address this in a systematic manner? And one of the recommendations that we had was like you have, let us say, a director, you have someone kind of director of vigilance, director operations, director kind of IT. We also said, let's have a position of director safety and security. And ideally that person should concentrate on women's safety. But however, the recommendation could not be met. But I mean, even some of the basic tweaking of manpower, the org structure, I believe would go a long way in improving the violence against women scenario. But it's just that there's no one in the institute, in these agencies, which is even kind of looking at these questions is a big issue.
Thanks for that. So we're going to shortly sort of move to questions now, and we've got some very interesting questions. I know some of the speakers have answered that in the chat already, but we have two questions around how we can capture overlapping vulnerabilities or social political vulnerabilities of women, like class, caste, LGBTQ, particularly around very vulnerable gender minorities. For example, trans women in India face discrimination from cops. So how do we effectively map, but also how can we be concerned about the vulnerabilities of these communities as we do so? And I'm throwing that open to any panelists that would like to take that question. I know Kalpana has addressed this in part.
I'm happy to start. I think, you know, the intersectional perspective is something that we've all recognized is really, it's very important to take that when we look at understand any set of discriminatory practices. And so therefore, if we, you know, for example, trans people, I completely, like the issue of public toilets. You know, I think in public spaces, public toilets is a very big issue. Women in India, and I know in many other countries, have a big problem because there are not enough public toilets. In fact, in Delhi, when we started doing a bit of a campaign to get more women bus drivers, we found that one of the issues was that none of the bus depots had women's toilets. Now, how do you expect a woman to work the whole day if there is no public toilet? But we recognize that even more vulnerable than women are trans women, because even where there are public toilets, they are unable to access them. So I think this bottom-up data generation is the only way to nuance our understanding of vulnerabilities. You know, so I think whether it's to surveys, focus group discussions, apps, you know, campaigns, finding ways to get people's voices, working with the media, so that you are able to understand. I'll give you an example. For example, in Delhi, we have many gated communities, right, where there are security guards at the entrance. Now, the woman who is living in that neighborhood, those security guards are bothered about her safety. But the woman, for example, the domestic worker who comes to work there, her safety is not often the concern of the security guard. So that same structure functions differently for different women, depending on their the intersectionality of their lives. So, you know, I think poor women, women in the informal sector, they face a very different set of vulnerabilities. Similarly, in public transport, right? If say for a woman in our city, if you are using your own public, or if you have your own vehicle, or if you're using the bus, or if you're using the metro, or if you're using the informal transport, which is the shared auto and stuff like that, your vulnerabilities are very different. And I think that's where the nuances of doing that data collection, you know, and giving therefore recommendations and pushing our municipal governments and transport authorities to actually respond to the diversity of people who live in our cities. Because as I think Jillian initially mentioned, I mean, our cities are designed for, you know, a male, able-bodied, cis male who goes to work in the morning, comes back in the evening, and probably does not have to do the work of care in his house, right? This is the idea with which our cities began. But these are not the people who inhabit our cities anymore. So how do we, from the urban planning discipline to every sector, begin to, you know, permeate the idea that who is the resident of the city for whom you are planning, for whom you are designing, for whom you're making it safe. And unless that gets nuanced, and as I keep saying, it will not happen overnight. And therefore, it is the hard work of pushing data. And I think that's where data really plays an important role. Because when you present data, you are giving voice to a group which previously did not have the voice. And so it is really important to get that voice out there. And so therefore, whether it's caste, class, race, we are seeing it globally, you know. Once you're able to, you know, build on that data, and sometimes it's one incident. Like for India, that Nirbhaya incident in 2012 changed the discourse around women's safety. Today, this murder has changed the discourse on Black lives. So there are moments in history which we also have to grab and push our agendas, push change at the time when people are also listening. And I think so it's a combination of movements, campaigns, data, and all of it feeding in to bring about social change.
Thanks for that, Kalpana. I have another question from Sushant Kumar on safeguards, particularly in context of smart cities. So if you could suggest an intervention that helps place safeguards around how data is handled, looking specifically at women's safety and rights, what would that look like? And Jillian and Amit, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Yeah, sure. I guess safeguarding can be quite a broad term, so I'll do my best to kind of specify it around safe in the city. So in terms of, you know, echoing, I guess, what Kalpana said, in that, you know, crowdsourcing or bottom up data collection is a way that we can start to bring represented voices and build our cities to be shaped by those voices to actually serve and be able to, you know, thrive in those particular spaces. You know, we do know that perception is a key thing, and I think throwing our hands up and saying it's impossible to understand this is, you know, too easy to do than kind of finding what ways we can kind of embed this way of engagement and the tools that can help facilitate closing that gap of information. So I think, you know, for us, we really believe that, you know, navigation or kind of mobility, this is all very much governed on how safe we feel, whether it's, you know, safety of like, will I fit in to this work, or do I have, you know, the facilities like bathrooms or toilets that will actually accept me, or, you know, is it kind of the fear and socialization that, you know, I shouldn't be out at night because I'm at a higher risk of being attacked, you know, even though I have to be out at this hour. So, you know, again, I think coming back into, you know, how do we design smart cities, well, we have to go even further to understand how do we actually become safe. Like there's, again, probably my backdrop shows, there's this IoT network of, smart technologies that are working to automate things, but we're automating the biases that already exist, which again are widening the gaps of accessibility and opportunities for, particular groups to also be able to participate and, add quite a lot of value back into the economy and society. So safeguarding and being able to target solutions around that really does, I think, have a place in technology and of course in kind of data advocacy of that information coming through. And it is a change of again, that timing, that there are these issues that are not going away and that they will creep into all types of businesses and all types of spaces. They aren't, only happening in one particular group, but they are happening differently to different groups. And being able to understand that, we'll be able to tailor the solutions more adequately to them.
Amit, are there any particular technology or accountability measures that you think would be important that would act as safeguards of data at a smart city level?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the general in terms of city planning, there are definitely a huge empirical evidence on what makes a safe city. Mm-hmm. And that can be deployed anywhere, be it smart city or not so smart city. So issues like a well-lit street, I mean, it's a fundamental for safe city. Eyes on street, low and porous boundary walls. I think there is a whole host of urban planning tools that can be deployed to make a city safe. But the bigger question is, why are the cities not using these proven? I mean, Jean Jacobs have been saying for donkeys of years what makes a good city, but yet we are not using these evidence-based approach. And so to me, I think so there is a problem on what city needs to do, but I think the bigger problem is how the city needs to do. So the whole process of engaging and engraving this process into a city planning, into a mobility planning, I think that requires a slightly different kind of discourse and approach. Because even if you look at who plans our city, and then Kalpana was right, that we are planning for able-bodied men, but the people who are planning are largely able-bodied men. So the question is, it's all garbage in and garbage out, right? So I think this requires a fundamental change in terms of how we approach city planning, mobility planning, and getting women at part of the solution generation is something which is very, very important. And we have seen from the mobility side, at least, there is a huge, huge lack of women's participation in the mobility planning. Just for a simple statistic, so about 49% of the overall population in India are women. But if you look at how many women use buses, and which is the predominant mode of transport in India, only 18% women use buses. 82% of what buses carry are men. Why is this? And I think we believe that safety and security has a very strong linkage why we women are not having the freedom to move and come.
And sort of on that note, Amit, I think you raised a really important point that we really need to enhance the participation and involvement of women at decision-making levels. And on that, Kalpana, given the work you referenced initially around creating these partnerships, involving women, whether it is at the grassroots level or through other organizations, how can we establish the right kind of partnerships to bring these voices to the fore? And what does that look like, considering maybe the role of a steward in engaging these different groups?
I think it has to be done on both sides, so at the grassroots level, we need to engage with diversity of our city.
Kalpana, sorry, I seem to have
lost.
So
whether it's women's group with different labels, I'm going to put my video off. I think you can hear me better then.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I said I think we have to work from two sides, from both sides. So at the level of the community, at the grassroots, we need to work with women's organizations, community-based organizations, you know, LGBTQ groups, people who work with the disability sector, elderly, children, to ensure that the voices are fed in. And this can be done through a range of tools. We have a really strong civil sector, for example, and they need to be made part of the planning. On the other side, like what Amit mentioned, that we should have a director who looks at safety, I really think cities need to have kind of an entire division which looks at safety, which cross-cuts the different other elements. So it could be the transport department, it could be planning, it could be the police, you know, so there's a kind of interdisciplinary approach. So then therefore the data that comes in is also interdisciplinary. So it's not through a single lens. So if you sort of ensure at the grassroots there are more voices, and you ensure at the level of the the government, that there is a willingness and a framework to hear those voices. See, the problem is there is a framework to hear those voices today. And so they are disparate. There is one SafetiPin, there is one WI, there's some other. We do all the work and then it just gets lost in the system. So I think a framework for a more systematic way of hearing the data, collecting the data, using it, analyzing it is needed for a true democratization of the process.
Sorry, Kalpana, I missed the last part. If you could just repeat that, I think we lost you.
I said for a true democratization of the data process, we need to have different ways, a framework through which we collect, use, analyze, and disseminate the data.
Thank you for that. I think we have one more question before we wrap up, and I'd love to hear Amit's perspective on this, given the surveys you carried out in Bhopal. One of the questions are, what is sort of the benefits of collecting big data over large-scale surveys? And the sort of second part of that question would be, how can we sort of make and ensure that existing surveys are far more gender inclusive? Amit, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. So let me answer the second question first. I think, and this is what we came out from our surveys that we did in Bhopal was, one is designing of the questionnaire to be gender inclusive. That's one part. But second part we found was especially issues like crime against women. And we found that when men were interviewing women, the response was not there. But when women started interviewing women, we saw a much greater response and much more openness in terms of stating the issues which are faced. So even how do you conduct the interview? How do you conduct these focus group discussion? How do you conduct this interview is also very important to get the right perspective and the correct kind of happening. So current baseline around safety and mobility. So that's one. The other important thing is how do you then take this data and then make the change on ground, right? And I still remember some of these findings we presented, and I'm sure Kalpana was also there in that workshop, which had head of all the bus agencies across the country in one of the big national forums. And the response was that this can't be true. All the bus agencies, people who were planning bus operation in major cities and major states, when they heard issues like 80% harassment level, 85% harassment level, 90% harassment levels from cities, after cities, they said it can't be true. And the reason why they said can't be true, because these agencies never collected this data. So the question then becomes, one is the collection of part and making it that we collect in the site manner. Second is, how do you disseminate the result? How do you kind of communicate the stories? How do you communicate the numbers? I mean, if 82% of bus transport users are men, then it is showing that something is not right. Why is this skewness in terms of the gender profile? So I think that's where we have to start. And I think, and then maybe just touch upon this whole issue of free public transport, which was asked by someone. I think that's also one of the reasons, and what we felt even in Bhopal's study was showed that almost 70% women were spending far less amount of money on transport compared to men, because they had a limited pot which was allocated for the travel. And so this was also impacting their mobility and therefore in their workforce participation. And what we found in Delhi was, interestingly, that almost 25-26% of the bus transport users in Delhi were women. But once the government made public transport free, the number went up to 40+%. And so that's the power of correct pricing. And there was a study which was done by CSE which found how Delhi Metro is so expensive that it's difficult for women to use that as a mode. So how do you then price and make sure that it is much more inclusive is also something that needs to be kept in mind.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amit. My sort of last question before I wrap it up, sort of the concept of stewardship as we presented it, I mentioned may have some opportunities in addressing some of these issues. And based on what was presented as challenges, where do you see the role of a steward in this space? And what kind of role do you think an intermediary could play in better facilitating not just the collection of data, but sharing it in a way that's secure? And I'll leave that as an open question before we wrap.
I'll jump in and say a couple things about the privacy and security. So I think consent is a really big piece here. Especially technology companies have been very challenged recently about how they use the data and how that's not communicated or consented by the users. So this kind of surveillance capitalism has emerged and made it really difficult to see, for users to see what is actually being done. And I think the biggest part is being able to have transparency and accountability. And we really hope that there is starting to become this shift with some of our work with Uber and now some other big companies that are, reporting openly about what types of sexual assaults and sexual harassment figures. And by doing so, that actually enables, a way of classifying this type of information and actually being able to benchmark across different industries or compare to national averages and start to, again, understand the scale of the issue as well as how we can actually tackle it. So I think if businesses and products that are facilitating the data collection are very open and transparent and showing through their communication, through their brand, through the publications, then it does become this two-way benefit of being able to understand that information, understand that impact, understand the accessibility and the other kind of considerations, again, really driven by safety, that will actually, bring us to a place where we can make these changes, hopefully a lot more rapidly.
Thanks. And any final points, Kalpana, on sort of where you see a steward potentially adding benefit or value here?
Yeah, I think the idea of data stewardship can be a very interesting way of diversifying how it's collected, where it's collected, and who all has a role in both collecting and using the data. So, it's sort of the agencies collect the data from the people and they use kind of, it's a very, it's a sort of a one-way street. I think we need to look at it as really as a process. Stakeholders in a city, and everybody wants a better city. And how do we use data? How do we get over the, wariness about data? On the other side, we have issues of privacy, especially for women. I think privacy is very, because you do not want your data to be shared in any way that could endanger your own lives in any way. So I think it more democratic, sort of make sure processes are formalized, ad hoc thing. Right now, I find there's a lot of data, but nobody's broad stewardship role can be in setting up a framework through which is accessible to people. So for example, me as how do I ensure there are platforms and spaces where I can share? I'm happy to share certain kinds of information without, of course, risking anyone's privacy, but where can I add other information and data that's there? So I think it's both the sharing as well as ensuring privacy is maintained. And it's a good discussion to have, yes.
Thank you, Kalpana. I'm sorry, I think we lost you at the end again. Did you have anything else, or did we lose you at the end?
My last was that this is a good discussion to have on data stewardship.
Okay.
It needs to be done, yeah.
Thank you for that. I think the only sort of follow-up question I had on the role that a steward could play in unlocking data from various different sources is whether you see the private sector as being an important stakeholder, and how we should sort of engage with private sector players who are collecting forms of big data. But I think this discussion could go on, and I'd love to take this offline with all of you as well. So sort of on this topic of collecting data, I know the entire discussion we have focused on what it would mean to better collect data, share data. But as Kalpana rightly pointed out initially, these solutions are not cannot be purely solved with data, and we don't want to fall into the trap of data solutionism either. It really takes having women not only in decision-making power, but being able to have a sort of wide variety or diverse voices represented in our data as well. And I think Amit brought out some very interesting points about what we need to do to hold governments accountable, to create systems and entities that can not only collect and incentivize this collection of data, but also manage and maintain it in a way that's sustainable. It was really interesting also to hear, from Jillian's perspective of how things, have worked and what the best practices are in the UK. So I'm excited to explore this concept of data stewardship a little bit further as well.